So I recently opened up my GitHub sponsors again. I've been getting back into open source stuff, and I figured if people want to support me, then they can. But part of doing that, I wanted to display the people that are sponsoring me publicly on a page on my website. And I tweeted about that here. You can see it's like a page, and if I open it up, yeah, it's got a title, it's got some text, it's got a call to action, and then a sort of sponsors grid. Now, if I reload that page again, you can kind of see, it's pretty quick, there's a loading state. So all of this data here is being fetched from the GitHub API and then cached for 12 hours, but it's being loaded after the page has been rendered. The main reason for doing that is because the GitHub API itself can be quite slow. Even with my 3 sponsors here, it can take up to a second sometimes. The way this all works on the front end is fairly simple. I've got some code here for the Alpine component sponsors grid. I've got a property, and inside of the init callback, I just set that property to a reactive object. And all of that is done by this defer magic property. So if I go ahead and open up the JavaScript for that as well, you can see we've got this loading prop and the value, and then we make a fetch request to the server and process the data, and eventually we store it back into that value and set loading to false. So that's all pretty straightforward. You'd have some sort of internal API handling those requests, but I wanted to over-engineer a very simple problem. So I implemented a deferred property system on the back end as well. So this is what my controller looks like. It's a pretty standard Laravel controller. It's got an invoke method because it's a single action, and it eventually returns a view. I've got some stuff in here for SEO, but at the very top, there's this call to defer add. Now, this is the server-side implementation for my deferred properties. So I provide the property key, sponsors. It's the same thing that we were passing from the front end, but the second argument is a closure. And this is sort of like a factory. This is what should return the value for the property. The callback itself gets passed through Laravel's container, so you can do dependency injection, which is what I'm doing here to get the sponsors service class. And then all I'm doing is caching that value for 12 hours. The interesting part is actually inside of the defer class itself. So I've got a facade wrapping it, but it's a service class under the hood. This is the add method here. So the key and factory that we pass through just get stored into an array. But then there are 3 lines of code here, and they reference an expected property. And if I go up to the constructor, you can see that the current request is being injected into this class, and we're just pulling out that defer property from the query string. Now, the 3 lines of code themselves seem a little bit suspicious at first because there's this throw statement in here. But what we're actually doing is using an exception to short-circuit Laravel's regular request-response lifecycle. And what that means is we can avoid unnecessarily rendering views and stuff like that. Any logic that you've got inside of your controller won't be executed because we've thrown an exception. So if there are some expected deferred props in the current request, and every single expected prop has been registered, we throw this defer short circuit exception. And the value that we're passing to that exception is actually the array of deferred props. So we loop over all of the registered deferred props and the expected ones and just append them to an array. Again, pass in that callback through the container so that we can do dependency injection. The real magic lies in the exception handler itself. So if I go to the Bootstrap app file, so I've registered an exception handler specifically for the defer short circuit exception. Normally Laravel would throw a 500 error for this with the error page locally, or just the plain 500 server error page in production. But instead we can register a callback function to override that behavior. The front end is expecting a JSON response, so we can just return that here, a JSON response with the deferred property data, and then tack on the xDeferred header that the front end is checking for. And the result is a cohesive front end back end system for deferred properties with Alpine. So if I open the network tab and refresh the page, you can see that request goes out, and then the response has all of the sponsors here. Now this is massively over-engineered for what the problem was. I could have just created a controller and returned that JSON response directly, but this feels a lot nicer. It feels more inertia-esque or Livewire-esque. All of my deferred properties are defined inside of the controller, so it's all co-located, meaning if I want to know what deferred properties I'm using on this page, I can just come to the controller where I'm returning the blade view.